I never expected my life to change so drastically after Dad died, but sometimes fate orchestrates transformations we can never predict. Growing up, I lived with an unspoken sense of security, anchored by my father's unwavering devotion and the modest, comfortable house he called his own. That little place on the outskirts of town was more than just a building. It was our emotional stronghold, a testament to the struggles he overcame and the hopes he cherished for me. I was only 17 when he passed away suddenly, leaving me caught between heartbreak and the naive belief that my mother would protect what he had built for us. I soon learned how foolish that assumption was. As the funeral flowers wilted, she wasted no time in turning the only home I had ever known into her golden ticket for a fresh start with the new man in her life. It wasn't just a betrayal, it felt like a betrayal carved in steel, echoing through every memory I had of Dad leaning against the porch railing or showing me how to fix a loose floorboard. She sold the house without telling me, using the money to fund her new husband's questionable dream. Brett was his name, a man with no discernible ambition, except for a nebulous boat-building project that seemed more like a fantasy than a feasible venture. My mother, Linda, met him at a local bar where he regaled her with grandiose tales of sea escapades he had supposedly undertaken in his youth. How she fell for his story so quickly remains a mystery, but within weeks of Dad's funeral, she announced they were in love. I vividly remember her describing him as a swashbuckling hero, a beacon of excitement in her dull, routine life. She must have clung to those illusions tightly because when the real Brett emerged, unemployed, manipulative, and relentlessly mooching off her, she didn't just turn a blind eye, she actively enabled him. The house that Dad spent years paying off was gone in a flash, replaced by a brand new boat that Brett claimed would make them millions. It took less than a year for Brett to leave her for another woman, who reportedly had an even bigger bank account. The heartbreak she felt was overshadowed, at least for me, by the very anger I couldn't extinguish. Her betrayal wasn't a footnote in my life, it was the chapter heading. I left for college soon after, determined to carve out my own future. My grief for Dad was matched only by a burning desire to put as much distance as possible between me and the household I'd been forced to endure. During my sophomore year, word reached me that Brett had taken off, leaving Mom high and dry. She'd poured every cent from Dad's house sale into that boat, and once it was complete, Brett used it as his ticket to ingratiate himself with someone wealthier. Any pity I might have felt for her was smothered by the still bitterness that churned in my stomach. She had betrayed my father's memory and robbed me of the one piece of property that was rightfully mine. I channeled my anger into my studies, working hard to earn scholarships and part-time jobs that would keep me afloat. My phone calls to Mom dwindled until they were practically non-existent. I believed the best revenge was success, that if I became someone unstoppable, I'd never need to rely on her again. At night, I tried to bury the resentful thoughts, but they always seeped into my dreams, reminding me I had an unpaid debt of vengeance. Over the next decade, I methodically assembled a life I could be proud of. I found a job in marketing right after graduation, quickly proving myself indispensable with my work ethic. By the time I was 28, I'd moved on to a Fortune 500 company, using my skills to rise through the ranks. Promotions came with bigger responsibilities and burdens, but I carried them eagerly, motivated by the specter of everything my mother had taken from me. My coworkers saw me as a driven career woman who thrived on competition. Little did they know I was propelled by a deep-seated vow to outgrow my past. My mother's name was rarely spoken in my circle, as I refused to even acknowledge she existed unless necessary. To keep the memories at bay, I threw myself into countless projects and poured every spare minute into professional development. On the rare occasions she called, I was cordial but distant, offering no personal details. She'd briefly hint at financial troubles or a new scheme to recoup her losses, but I always steered the conversation away from her desperation. If she hoped to guilt me into helping, she was mistaken. I was done playing her game. It was 3 years ago when she finally mustered the nerve to show up at my doorstep, eyes glassy with desperation. I still recall the knock on my apartment door late one Friday night. I'd been working on a report for Monday's big meeting, half asleep in front of my laptop. When I opened the door, I barely recognized the woman standing in the hallway, her face gaunt and her hair limp, as if the weight of her own regrets had crushed all vitality out of her. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back, letting her embrace thin air. She started babbling about how she was living in a dingy motel, how she'd lost what little money she had left in a failed pyramid scheme. Apparently, Brett and his new partner were thriving somewhere in the Caribbean, posting pictures of a lavish lifestyle financed by her naivete. She said she was sorry for everything. Her voice trembled with tears, but I didn't flinch. My father's ghost loomed too large for me to feel any pity. I told her I was busy and shut the door before she could finish her plea. That night, I slept soundly, unburdened by remorse. Within a few months, I bought my first condo. It wasn't enormous, but it felt like a fortress of independence, something nobody could take away from me. Every time I walked through its door, I was reminded that I had achieved what my mother squandered: a stable home, owned through sheer hard work and careful saving. Dad's memory lingered in the little details of my decor: a framed photo of him and me at my high school graduation, the worn-out baseball glove he gave me when I was 10. Part of me thought about how proud he would be, seeing me succeed without leaning on the woman who betrayed us. I shared this space only with my golden retriever, Milo, who had a knack for sensing when I needed comfort. Most nights, I would curl up on the couch, scratching Milo behind the ears, and feel a sense of triumph. My phone would ring occasionally, displaying the same number I'd long since labeled "Do Not Answer." I kept it there, a reminder that the person on the other end once chose a con artist and a boat over the security of our family. As far as I was concerned, we were done. That illusion of finality didn't last. 2 months ago, a call from an unknown number rattled my phone at 6 in the morning. Against my better judgment, I answered, half expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. Instead, my mother's voice spilled out in panicked sobs. She needed help, she insisted, babbling incoherently about an eviction notice. Her landlord was kicking her out, and she had nowhere to go. I listened in silence, feeling a slight tremor in my hand. Whether from rage or the early hour, I couldn't tell. She finally pleaded, her voice cracking, "Can I stay with you?" I told her I'd think about it and hung up, my heart pounding with a mixture of long-forgotten anger and something dangerously close to pity. But pity was a cheap currency I refused to spend. By lunchtime, she'd left a dozen voicemails, each more desperate than the last. I sat in my office, staring at my phone like it was a coiled snake. A decade of fury and resentment had steeled me, but hearing her that vulnerable tore open wounds I thought had scarred over. I knew I had to make a choice, one that would define the rest of my life. I spent a sleepless night grappling with the morality of turning away a parent, even one who had done such harm. Yet every time I considered letting her in, I recalled Dad's face, the very quiet pride in his eyes whenever he talked about our future. The house she sold had symbolized his sacrifices, and she had reduced it to mere currency for a man who used her and discarded her. Did such a betrayal deserve compassion? By dawn, I decided that it did not, at least not in the form of free lodging, but I wasn't done with her. I wanted her to experience a fragment of the helplessness I'd felt when she snatched my security away. So I crafted a plan that was equal parts justice and cruelty, fueled by the bitterness I'd carried for years. Maybe it was wrong, and maybe it wouldn't mend anything, but it would grant me something I'd never had: closure on my own terms. As I watched the sunrise through my bedroom window, I typed a curt text: "Come to my place at noon." I didn't bother adding any warmth or reassurance. If she wanted help, she would have to face my conditions. Noon arrived, and I opened the door before she could knock. She looked even worse in the daylight, hollow cheeks, trembling hands clutching a threadbare purse. Her eyes scanned my condo's polished floors and modern furnishings, and for a second, I caught a glimpse of envy flickering across her face. Then she mumbled an awkward greeting, voice cracking with uncertainty. I didn't offer her a seat. Instead, I leaned against the wall, arms folded, letting the tension sit like a boulder between us. Finally, she broke the silence. She apologized, again, for everything: the house, Brett, the lies. I listened without a hint of forgiveness in my eyes. When she finished, her tears left little salty trails along her cheeks. Then came her plea. She wanted a roof over her head, a chance to rebuild her life. I forced myself not to laugh at the irony. Rebuild, I thought, as if her own actions hadn't demolished mine. Still, I nodded slowly, feigning consideration. Then I told her my strict condition. She could stay in the spare bedroom for 3 months, but she'd pay rent, market rate, no discounts, and she'd do absolutely every menial chore I assigned. My tone left no room for negotiation. She swallowed her pride in a single audible gulp and nodded. I led her to the spare room, a cramped space that had served as a storage area. Boxes lined the walls, and the bed was little more than a narrow cot. She set her purse down without complaint, though her expression suggested she had expected a kinder setup. Over the next few days, I enforced a regime that mirrored my own grueling schedule. She was up at dawn to walk Milo, and she had to keep the condo spotless. I left her a list of housekeeping tasks every morning, from scrubbing toilets to vacuuming rugs. And, of course, she owed me rent, which meant she needed a job. She spent her afternoons pounding the pavement, filling out applications wherever she could. By the end of the first week, she landed part-time work at a grocery store. Each evening, I inspected her chores and critiqued any imperfections. It was petty maybe, but it felt like reclaiming something I lost. She never complained openly, though I saw tears glistening in her eyes some nights. If she thought my heart would soften, she was mistaken. This was a lesson in consequences, long overdue. As the weeks passed, I discovered a dark sense of satisfaction in watching her struggle. Each time she returned from work, exhausted and weighed down by grocery bags of discounted food, I felt vindicated. I wasn't harming her physically, but I was dealing her a relentless barrage of emotional atonement. Yet, oddly, living under the same roof forced us into more contact than we'd had in years. Occasionally, she'd make a clumsy attempt at conversation, asking about my job, or Milo, or whether I was seeing anyone special. I would respond with clipped, monosyllabic answers that killed any chance of real dialogue. Still, despite my anger, I was noticing details I'd missed before. The trembling in her hands didn't always seem to stem from nerves. Her breath was sometimes labored, even when she was just sitting. I suspected some medical issue, but I refused to ask or care. She had forfeited my concern long ago. Every evening, she'd retreat to that cramped bedroom, closing the door as if stepping into a confessional. I'd hear her muffled coughing through the very thin walls and just feel nothing but the chill of my own resolve. This was the price she had to pay. One night, after a late shift at work, I came home to find her slumped on the kitchen floor. Milo was anxiously pawing at her, and she clutched her chest as though every breath was a battle. My anger told me to walk away, but a pang of dread forced me to kneel beside her. Her skin felt clammy, and her eyes were clouded with pain. She gasped for air, begging me not to call an ambulance, likely because she couldn't afford it. For a moment, I stood frozen, torn between resentment and almost forgotten compassion. Finally, I helped her onto the couch, fetched her a glass of water, and waited for the episode to pass. It took 20 agonizing minutes, during which she kept apologizing between ragged breaths. I said nothing. Once her breathing stabilized, she admitted she'd been having chest pains for months, but was too broke to see a doctor. 1,000 barbed replies teetered on my tongue, but I swallowed them. She looked so pathetic, so genuinely scared. Yet, even then, I felt no forgiveness. Instead, I felt an unsettling sense of power. After all these years, I finally held the upper hand in every way. In the following days, a very cold calculation took shape in my mind. Her health was failing, that much was clear. She might need medical attention soon, but she had no means to pay for it. The question was, did I care? A warped part of me felt that if she died under my roof, it would be the grandest vengeance of all, like a final punctuation mark on her betrayal. But then I thought about Dad. For all the anger I carried, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wouldn't want me to become this callous. He'd always taught me to stand up for myself, but never to lose my humanity. And so, I reached a compromise with my conscience. I would drive her to a free clinic, offer basic support, but nothing more. No warm embraces, no heartfelt forgiveness. Just enough help to keep me from turning into a monster in my own eyes. That evening, I slipped a brochure for a nearby clinic under her door. She found it the next morning and gave me an extremely tearful thank you. I nodded, face truly impassive, heart locked. My plan was still in motion. This was merely a brief detour. At the clinic, the doctor diagnosed her with advanced heart disease. She needed medication and possible surgery, neither of which she could afford. I could see the resignation in her eyes, as if she expected me to let her die. And for one brief, horrible second, I considered it. But images of Dad stormed into my mind. His kindness, his unwavering support. I couldn't let her die and still look at myself in the mirror. So I paid for her medications, wordlessly covering the costs while she stared at me in astonishment. Gratitude wavered on her lips, but I turned away, unable to bear it. At home, she tried to thank me again, tears of relief shining in her eyes. I silenced her with a glare. This wasn't me forgiving her. This was me refusing to let hatred turn me into a version of Brett, someone who used people and then cast them aside. I still wanted her to suffer for what she did, but not at the cost of my own soul. That night, I lay awake, grappling with a swelling sense of unease. Revenge was supposed to taste sweet, but all I felt was an emptiness that gnawed at me. In the morning, I found her cleaning the living room, struggling through wheezing breaths but determined to fulfill her chores. A wave of pity washed over me, quickly replaced by the memory of how she'd sold Dad's house for a dream that crushed both of us. As her 3-month deadline approached, she timidly asked if she could stay longer, her eyes reflecting genuine fear. I looked at her, the woman who had once turned her back on everything Dad represented, and I felt the final piece of my plan crystallize. I told her she had 1 week to vacate, no extensions. Her face went slack with despair, but she nodded in silent defeat. On the final day, she packed her meager belongings, tears forming a steady stream. She thanked me for everything, even as I stood there, arms crossed, offering no comfort. When she closed the door behind her, I felt a mix of triumph and sorrow. This was the revenge I'd fantasized about for years. She was destitute, alone, and in failing health, just as she'd left me emotionally crippled so long ago. As Milo whined at the door, I whispered an apology to Dad. Then I locked it. I remember the day my world cracked open, even though it looked so ordinary at first. The sky was overcast, the house was quiet, and I was sitting in the living room with my fiancé, Mark, going over last-minute wedding details. My mother had just called to ask if we needed extra chairs for distant relatives, and I felt that mixture of excitement and nerves that every bride knows too well. There was a strange heaviness in the air, though, something intangible I couldn't name. Then my sister, Rachel, sent me a single text message. "We need to talk." At the time, I didn't think much of it. We hadn't spoken properly for a while, but I assumed she wanted to discuss the seating arrangement or share some sisterly advice. Mark and I had no idea how drastically everything would change after that call. Even now, I can still picture the anxious flutter in my stomach when I heard her voice on the other end. Her tone was clipped, urgent, and lacking the warmth I'd always associated with her. It was the first sign that something was deeply off and that my wedding, just days away, would never be the same. I remember thinking she must be in trouble or maybe fighting with her husband. She and Tom had seemed happy once, but rumors had been swirling for months that their relationship was on the rocks. I just never imagined how she would drag me into it or blame me for something unthinkable. When I finally sat down to call her back, my heart pounded uncomfortably. I still remember glancing at Mark, who offered me an encouraging smile, but something in me tightened like a coiled spring. Rachel answered on the second ring and jumped straight to the point. She didn't ask about my wedding plans or discuss what color dress she'd wear as my maid of honor. Instead, she calmly stated that Tom had filed for divorce and she wanted me to admit my role in it. I recall the immediate protest rising in my throat. My role? I had none. I couldn't fathom what she was implying, so I demanded she explain. That was when she dropped the bomb. She claimed Tom had left her because of an affair he believed I'd been having with him. The shock was like a physical blow. At first, I laughed in disbelief because it seemed so ridiculous. Tom was my brother-in-law, a man I respected but rarely even saw outside of family gatherings. I asked how anyone could possibly believe something so insane, but Rachel was utterly serious. She insisted Tom confess to her that I had seduced him, leading to irreconcilable problems in their marriage. I thought it was a sick joke, yet her voice trembled with hurt and accusation, and I realized she truly believed, or claimed to believe, this twisted narrative. I ended the call feeling dizzy, outraged, and deeply wounded. It was the first time in my life that I felt genuinely betrayed by my own sister. I spent the next 2 days frantically trying to fix the mess she'd created. I called Tom, who didn't answer. I texted him, left voicemails. Nothing. Meanwhile, my mother and father started getting cryptic phone calls from Rachel, where she said I had confessed everything. Suddenly, my phone was exploding with messages from uncles, aunts, and cousins who were horrified that I could do such a thing. My parents were initially skeptical, until Rachel sent them a barrage of fabricated text screenshots, supposedly proving I'd been flirting with Tom for months. None of those messages were real. I'd never sent them, but Rachel was cunning enough to piece together old threads or alter them with new technology. Slowly, I realized I was battling a rumor war orchestrated by my own sister. My mother left me a hysterical voicemail telling me she couldn't face relatives if I went through with the wedding after committing such a sin. My father, always the more stoic one, told me he needed some time to think about whether he could even walk me down the aisle. Everything was spiraling out of control. Mark was furious and wanted to confront Rachel in person, but I convinced him to wait. I still believed, foolishly, that the truth would come out soon. I was wrong. Each day, more people from my extended family sided with Rachel. She was crying about her broken marriage, about how Tom had left her in tears, about how I had supposedly crept into their life like a saboteur. I felt like I was living someone else's nightmare, a horrifying story penned by a vengeful spirit. Yet, it was very real, and the wedding day was racing toward me with unstoppable momentum. I tried reasoning with my parents in person. I drove 2 hours to their house, thinking that if I looked them in the eyes, they'd see the truth. When I arrived, my mother was in tears, muttering about how she never raised us to be so cruel. My father, arms crossed, said he was disappointed and ashamed. They demanded I apologize to Rachel. I refused. How could I apologize for something I didn't do? I offered to show them my phone records, social media accounts, anything to prove my innocence. But Rachel had gotten to them first, brandishing her doctored evidence. My mother screamed at me for forging phone logs when I revealed them. My father turned his back, refusing to even look at my explanations. I begged them to consider that Rachel might be lying, but they saw her as the wounded victim. After all, Tom had left the house. She'd been the one crying in their arms. In their eyes, I was the unscrupulous sister who had destroyed a sacred union. I still remember the heartbreak of that moment, standing in my childhood home, once filled with memories of birthdays and holiday gatherings, now echoing with resentment and disbelief. Finally, I told them I was still getting married, with or without their blessing. My mother burst into another round of tears, and my father declared he wouldn't attend. I left that day feeling both furious and utterly alone. In the days leading up to my wedding, I found out that almost my entire family was planning to boycott. Even my favorite aunt, who'd always been warm and loving, canceled at the last minute. Rachel had spun her story so effectively that only a handful of relatives dared to show up. Mark's family, however, stood firmly by our side. They believed me, had no reason not to, and offered their unwavering support. Mark himself was the rock I clung to, though I knew the strain was getting to him too. Who wants to marry into a family at war with itself? On the day of the ceremony, I walked down the aisle without my father. A close friend stood in for him. My mother was absent, and I refused to look at the empty seats where my parents should have been. I kept my chin up, determined not to let Rachel's lies tarnish the vows I was about to make. When Mark and I said I do, it was a bittersweet moment. I was marrying the love of my life, yet a huge part of me felt hollow, as if the people who had shaped my identity had vanished into thin air. The reception was smaller than planned, but surprisingly joyful. Friends toasted us, promising that truth would prevail. I took comfort in their optimism, though in the back of my mind I doubted my family would come around quickly. Rachel's betrayal ran deep, and I knew the damage might be permanent. After the wedding, life settled into a tense routine. Mark and I moved to a new apartment across town, hoping the distance would help us start fresh. For a while, we focused on each other, ignoring the ongoing family drama. We hosted dinner parties for friends, explored new hobbies, and talked about starting a family. Yet, whenever my phone chimed, my pulse raced, afraid of more attacks from Rachel or disapproving messages from our parents. Weeks turned into months, and I eventually learned that Rachel and Tom's divorce had been finalized. Tom was rumored to have moved to another state, though I never heard the full story. Despite my repeated attempts to contact him and clarify the truth, he never responded. Perhaps he was too ashamed or simply didn't care. Meanwhile, Rachel posted cryptic updates on social media about betrayal and heartbreak, continuing to paint me as the villain. My parents invited her to Sunday dinners while I remained excluded. Sometimes I contemplated driving to their house just to show up unannounced, but I was tired of banging my head against the wall. If they wanted to believe Rachel's lies, so be it. Mark supported my decision to cut ties for my own sanity. I still had nightmares about it all, dreams where my parents looked at me with disgust, or where Rachel smirked triumphantly as I stood in a torn wedding gown. It was exhausting, but I was determined to move forward. A year later, I discovered I was pregnant. The news filled me with a cautious joy, tempered by the ache of knowing my parents wouldn't be part of the celebration. Still, Mark and I were thrilled, and we started preparing for our new arrival. One evening, as I was browsing baby names, my phone rang. It was my mother. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to answer. We hadn't spoken since before my wedding, over a year of silence, blame, and heartbreak. Curiosity got the better of me. I pressed accept. She congratulated me on the pregnancy, her voice tentative, as though trying not to scare me off. My father was on speaker, but he barely said a word. Their tone was conciliatory, even apologetic, which immediately made me suspicious. Then my mother brought up Rachel. She explained that Rachel had been trying to have a baby for months, but found out she was infertile. "It's devastating news," my mother lamented. "Rachel's taken it so hard, especially after losing Tom. We were hoping you could share your baby with her." My jaw dropped. I asked her to clarify. My mother, with my father's faint murmur of agreement in the background, said they wanted me to consider letting Rachel adopt my child or at least co-parent so Rachel could experience motherhood. I was so stunned I couldn't speak. After all the lies Rachel told, after the wedding boycott, and after they basically abandoned me, they wanted my child to soothe her pain? The audacity left me trembling with fury. I hung up on them. Seconds later, the phone rang again, but I ignored it. My mother left a voicemail, urging me to think it over for the sake of family unity. She insisted that if I did this one thing, it would mend all the wounds. I sat there, nauseated by the thought of sharing my baby with the very woman who had destroyed my reputation. Mark came home to find me pacing the living room, still clutching the phone. When I told him what happened, he looked as though he couldn't decide whether to laugh or punch a hole in the wall. The nerve of my parents was unbelievable. They had chosen Rachel's side, shattered my wedding, then conveniently resurfaced now that I had something she wanted. Their attempt to guilt me into giving up my child was beyond monstrous. Over the following weeks, the calls continued. My mother's messages escalated from polite pleas to emotional blackmail. She claimed that if I truly cared about Rachel's well-being, I would share the miracle of motherhood. My father chimed in once or twice, grumbling that I owed it to the family to help my sister start over. Each time, I felt more enraged, but also more resolute in my refusal. I decided not to respond anymore. Their manipulative words made it easy to see just how twisted their priorities had become. That's when Rachel herself showed up at my doorstep. I was 6 months pregnant and feeling drained from work. Mark was still at the office. When the doorbell rang, I glanced through the peephole and nearly slammed the door in her face. But she started yelling loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, so I opened it a crack. She looked disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair unkempt, as though she hadn't slept in days. Without waiting for an invitation, she pushed past me into the living room. I demanded she leave, but she sank onto the couch, pleading with me to listen. She said she regretted how things had turned out between us. She even hinted that Tom might have lied to her, though she never outright admitted she'd fabricated the cheating story. Then she started sobbing about how cruel life was, how she couldn't have a baby of her own, and how seeing me pregnant felt like a knife to her heart. I stood there, my hand protectively over my belly, feeling nothing but a cold anger. She had ruined my wedding, turned my family against me, and never once apologized. Now she wanted me to give her a piece of my happiness to fill the void she'd created. I let her talk until she was out of breath. Then, in the quiet that followed, I told her that I was done. Done with her lies, her drama, and the audacity of expecting I'd hand over my child. Her tears dried up quickly, replaced by a steely glare that reminded me just how ruthless she could be. Rachel's face twisted with rage as she accused me of being selfish. She even tried to guilt-trip me by invoking childhood memories, how I used to share my toys, how I was always protective of her. Now, she insisted, I was abandoning her in her greatest time of need. I laughed bitterly, reminding her that she had abandoned me first, peddling lies that cost me my family and ruined my wedding day. She slapped the couch cushion in frustration. In that moment, she looked ready to tear the entire place apart. Then, in a move so brazen it left me speechless, she demanded I let her adopt my baby once it was born, or else she'd make sure our parents never forgave me. I stared at her, a wave of adrenaline flooding my veins. Was she actually threatening me? My maternal instinct flared like a wildfire. Nobody was going to take my child from me, least of all the woman who had torpedoed my reputation. I told her to get out. When she refused, I grabbed my phone and threatened to call the police. That finally got her on her feet. She stormed to the door, spat out something about how I'd regret this, and slammed it behind her. My heart was pounding so violently I had to sit down. I knew then that the rift between us was permanent. She had declared war, and I wasn't about to surrender. Not this time. Mark arrived shortly after, and I recounted the entire confrontation. He held me in his arms and told me we'd do whatever it took to protect our family. That night, we agreed on a plan. We would take legal precautions. First, we installed a security system. Then we consulted a lawyer who advised us to document every harassing message or threat. If Rachel or my parents tried anything, we would have proof. My pregnancy was stressful enough without this drama, but we felt safer knowing we were taking steps to safeguard our future. A couple of weeks passed, and I heard little from Rachel or my parents. I began to relax, hoping maybe they had finally accepted my decision. But then, one morning, my mother showed up unannounced. She was carrying a bag of baby items, onesies, blankets, tiny socks, and wearing a forced smile. She tried to come inside, cooing about how a grandmother has rights. I blocked her at the threshold, reminding her that she'd forfeited those rights when she chose to believe Rachel's lies over my truth. She teared up, claiming she was just trying to make amends, but I saw through her. She'd always been easily manipulated by Rachel's sob stories. Despite my anger, part of me ached for the mother I once knew, but I couldn't let nostalgia cloud my judgment. I told her to leave and not to return unless she could respect my boundaries. Eventually, I went into labor. The birth was difficult, but Mark was my rock, and we welcomed a healthy baby boy we named Alexander. In the postpartum haze of exhaustion and wonder, I felt a powerful surge of love and protectiveness. Holding Alexander for the first time was like anchoring myself to a new reality, one where I was fiercely determined to protect my child from toxic influences, even if those influences were blood relatives. It was almost 2 weeks before I informed anyone in my family that Alexander had arrived. When my parents found out, they demanded to meet him. Rachel, too, sent messages claiming she deserved to see her nephew. I ignored them all. My focus was on recovering and bonding with my son. Then, late one evening, my father called. He said he was outside my building. I nearly panicked, thinking he'd forced his way in. Mark went downstairs to handle it. I watched from the window, heart hammering, as my father pleaded with Mark in the parking lot. Eventually, Mark came back and said Dad looked genuinely remorseful, begging for a chance to meet his grandson. After a long discussion, we decided to allow a brief visit under strict conditions. Dad came up, sat on the edge of the couch, and quietly asked to hold Alexander. I let him, but not without reminding him of the boundaries. He cried silently as he rocked the baby in his arms. For a fleeting moment, I saw the father I once adored, the man who taught me how to ride a bike and cooked pancakes on Sunday mornings. That moment of vulnerability shattered when he started making excuses for Rachel. He murmured something about how she'd been confused during her divorce, how Tom might have misled her, how she'd just lashed out in desperation. I stiffened. It always came back to them defending her. When he suggested it would be nice if Rachel could at least see Alexander, I stood up and took my baby from him. In a calm but firm voice, I told him I would never allow Rachel near my child. I reminded him how she had lied about me, destroyed my wedding, and threatened me in my own living room. I asked if he'd forgotten those humiliations. My father lowered his head, silent. After a moment, he got up to leave. He glanced back with teary eyes, but he didn't argue anymore. As the door clicked shut, I felt a complex blend of sadness and triumph. I was sad to watch my father go, but triumphant that I hadn't caved to their manipulative demands. From then on, Mark and I decided to move forward without my family. We wanted Alexander to grow up in a loving environment, free from the toxicity that had poisoned so much of my past. But the story doesn't end there. One day, while scrolling social media, I saw a post from Rachel, pictures of a baby, along with a caption about a blessing finally bestowed. My stomach dropped. Was she claiming to have a child now? Something felt off. I clicked on her profile and found more photos, all of them suspiciously lacking clarity. Then I recognized a blanket pattern, one identical to a gift my mother had once mentioned buying for me. I felt an icy chill. Was Rachel implying that my baby was hers? Enraged, I confronted my parents over the phone. They denied any knowledge, but I could sense my mother's voice shaking when she said Rachel must be posting old pictures from a friend's newborn. It made no sense, and I was certain something sinister was going on. My lawyer advised me to document everything. Then I started receiving messages from acquaintances congratulating me on letting Rachel adopt my child. I nearly threw my phone across the room in outrage. That was when I realized Rachel was spreading a new lie, that she and I had come to a peaceful agreement where she would become Alexander's adoptive mother or co-parent. My fury reached a boiling point. We tightened our security, blocked anyone who spread that rumor, and prepared for a legal fight if it escalated. Yet, even as the months passed, Rachel kept posting vague references to her son, fueling confusion among distant relatives who weren't aware of the real story. A cousin even called to scold me for not letting Rachel visit her baby. I set the record straight in no uncertain terms, warning that I'd sue anyone who aided Rachel in her deceit. The drama was exhausting, but I refused to be a victim again. If Rachel wanted to pretend, I'd let her. It was a pathetic fantasy, but it was powerless as long as she had no legal claim. As Alexander grew, I sent occasional updates to my father, telling him that if he could respect our boundaries, he might see his grandson again. Rachel, however, would remain persona non grata in our lives. I made that crystal clear. My father said he understood, but I didn't fully trust him. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I got an unexpected letter from Tom. Yes, the same Tom who had vanished after divorcing Rachel. His handwriting was shaky, and the envelope carried a return address from another state. Inside was an apology so raw it took me several minutes to absorb. He admitted that Rachel had concocted the affair story out of desperation to shift blame for their failing marriage. He wrote that he had never wanted me implicated, but had felt cornered by Rachel's emotional manipulation. His confession was everything I needed to finally clear my name in the eyes of anyone still doubting me. With Tom's written statement in hand, I had the ultimate weapon. I scanned his letter, typed up a thorough account of the real events, and mailed copies to my parents, extended family, and close friends. I included the vile messages Rachel had sent me about adopting my baby, along with Tom's letter as irrefutable proof of her deceit. The backlash against Rachel was swift. Suddenly, those relatives who had called me a homewrecker realized they'd been supporting a liar. My parents were humiliated. They called me, sobbing, apologizing profusely. I told them that while they were free to seek my forgiveness, I would never forget their choice to abandon me when I needed them most. I cut the conversation short, refusing their pleas for a meeting. As for Rachel, she tried to spin the narrative yet again, claiming Tom's letter was fake, that I was forging more evidence. But this time, no one believed her. She had cried wolf too many times. Her social media turned into a war zone of accusations and defenses, eventually forcing her to disappear from most platforms. In an almost comedic twist, she lost her job when her employer discovered she'd been using company resources to doctor evidence. The last I heard, she moved back in with my parents, too disgraced to show her face in town. I can't deny the satisfaction I felt watching her world crumble. After all the pain she inflicted, seeing her lies exposed was the sweetest revenge. And I found no pity in my heart for her. She had tried to steal my joy, wreck my wedding, and even claim my child as her own. Her downfall felt like justice served. As for me, I continued building a life filled with love and resilience. Mark and I eventually bought a small house with a big backyard, perfect for Alexander to run around in. I steered clear of family gatherings, only maintaining a cautious, limited contact with my father who occasionally visited his grandson. My mother tried to repair our bond, but each time she stepped toward me, I recalled how she'd asked me to hand over my baby to Rachel. That wound would never truly heal. In the end, I learned that self-respect means setting boundaries so firm that no one's lies can breach them. I didn't need to forgive Rachel to move on. I just needed to watch her deception unravel and claim my own sense of peace. Life didn't magically become perfect, but it became authentically mine, free from the toxic ties that once strangled me. When I look at Alexander giggling on the swings or chasing fireflies at dusk, I'm reminded of the moment I chose my family, my husband, my child, and myself, over the guilt trips of people who were supposed to protect me but instead believed the worst. I have no regrets. Perhaps that's the most unpredictable ending of all. The day I finally found peace wasn't when my family asked for forgiveness, but when I decided they no longer had the power to hurt me. I remember exactly where I was when my mother called to tell me she and my father had finally gotten married. Sitting in my cramped kitchen, half awake and nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, I listened as she spoke in a hurried, almost excited tone. At first, I thought she was sharing news about a friend or distant relative, but when she said, "Your father and I tied the knot last weekend," I nearly choked on my drink. I fumbled for words, my mind struggling to reconcile the fact that my parents, together for nearly 3 decades, had never actually been legally married. That was bizarre enough. Yet, what truly stung was the realization that I hadn't received an invitation or even a hint that this event was happening. My mother carried on about how it had been a tiny, intimate ceremony and that nobody really came except a few close friends. I hung on every word, waiting for the moment she'd explain why her only child wasn't considered close enough to be included. Instead, she stumbled through a vague apology, sounding more guilty than remorseful. She insisted it was simply easier to keep the ceremony low-key. Perhaps they thought my presence would complicate matters, or they just didn't want to bother with me. Either way, I felt blindsided. I'd grown up believing they were already married. They'd worn rings and celebrated anniversaries, telling me stories of their wedding day. Now I learned those stories had been fabrications or half-truths. The phone line hummed with tension as I struggled to respond. Eventually, I stammered out a hollow congratulations, more out of shock than genuine happiness. Inside, I could feel something collapsing, a sense of trust I hadn't realized was so fragile. The revelation sliced through me like a jagged blade, leaving me speechless. The next day, I grappled with my conflicting emotions. Should I confront them, demand explanations, or quietly nurse my wounds? Feeling lost, I reached out to my paternal grandmother, a straightforward woman who always defended me. When I told her the news, she erupted in anger, furious that her own son had orchestrated such a secret ceremony. She told me she hadn't known about it either. Hearing her outrage validated the hurt I felt. Then I called my maternal grandparents, who lived states away, and discovered they too were blindsided. Neither side of the family had been invited or informed. My mother's parents were livid, and in their shock, they insisted this slight wouldn't go unaddressed. Within days, my grandparents had begun discussing ways to give my parents a taste of their own medicine. It was almost comical how quickly the two sets of grandparents, who often disagreed over trivial things, united in shared indignation. They felt my parents needed a stark reminder of what it meant to exclude one's own flesh and blood. While they hatched plans, I paced through my apartment, trying to make sense of everything. Part of me just wanted an apology, something genuine to fix the rupture. But as the days passed without any gesture from my parents, anger replaced longing. Soon, a family conference call took place, grandparents on both sides talking over each other as they brainstormed how to proceed. They proposed we organize a massive family reunion without telling my parents. At first, I balked at the idea. It seemed spiteful. Yet, the more I thought about it, the more I saw it as fitting payback. Let them experience the sting of being left out. Justice might be messy, but it was certainly overdue. I ended the call feeling oddly empowered, ready. In the following weeks, our plan gathered momentum. My grandparents contacted relatives far and wide, inviting them to a grand celebration at the old family homestead near my paternal grandparents' town. Cousins I hadn't seen since childhood promised to come. Everyone was sworn to secrecy. The entire event would be dedicated to honoring family roots, celebrating heritage, and paying tribute to ancestors. We planned a ceremony in the local chapel to remember my great-grandfather, followed by a reception featuring music, dancing, and more homemade food than anyone could possibly eat. My role involved helping arrange logistics, from booking the band to organizing decorations. My paternal grandmother and I spent hours sorting through dusty photo albums, selecting images that would be displayed on large boards for everyone to see. Each picture reminded me of a time when I believed my parents were a stable unit, loving and trustworthy. At moments, guilt gnawed at me. Was I stooping to their level, perpetuating a cycle of exclusion? But every time that thought arose, I recalled the humiliation and heartache I felt when I first learned of their secret wedding. They hadn't merely overlooked me, they'd intentionally chosen to hide the ceremony from everyone who should have mattered. So yes, a part of me craved to see their stunned faces once they realized they were the ones locked out. Late at night, I drift into uneasy sleep, torn between anger and the remnants of love I still felt for my parents. Revenge, even when justified, is rarely clean. I pressed forward, determined not to let them off easy. This was about accountability, about teaching them the impact of their choices. As plans solidified, I sensed a powerful current carrying me toward a confrontation I both dreaded and welcomed, uncertain how it might finally unfold. The day of the reunion arrived under bright sunshine and a gentle breeze. Family members descended upon the chapel, each greeting me with warm smiles and words of support. My grandparents on both sides kept me close, as though aware of the emotional weight I carried. In that sacred space, we lit candles for those who had passed, read their names aloud, and reminisced about their legacy. My chest tightened with conflicting emotions, mourning not just the dead, but also the familial bond my parents had shattered. After the service, everyone moved to the homestead. The band played upbeat tunes, children ran across the lawn, and the tantalizing aroma of roast chicken and freshly baked pies wafted through the air. There were photographs on display, a collage of our shared history. I couldn't help but notice countless pictures where my parents stood beside me. Their absence that day was a striking reminder of how drastically things had changed. For hours, I laughed, caught up with relatives, and even danced a little, but a knot of tension sat coiled in my belly, knowing this celebration had a hidden edge of retribution. At sunset, while sipping homemade lemonade, I felt my phone buzz incessantly. My father's name flashed on the screen, accompanied by rapid texts. Apparently, someone had slipped up, or perhaps a distant cousin had let the news spill. My parents knew about the reunion and were outraged at being excluded. A tight smile curved my lips as I realized the moment of confrontation had arrived. My grandparents surrounded me, ready to offer support. I inhaled slowly, bracing myself for the storm. They had played their hand first, and now it was my turn to show them exactly how it felt to be left in the dark. My phone kept vibrating. I excused myself from the crowd and found a quiet corner behind the house. With trembling fingers, I answered my father's call. The instant I said hello, his voice blasted through the speaker, a mix of fury and disbelief. "How dare you throw a family reunion and not invite us?" he shouted. My mother's angry muttering filtered in the background. My heart pounded, but I forced calm into my voice. "I thought keeping things small and intimate was just simpler," I said. There was a brief silence before he roared, "Don't you dare throw our words back at us!" But that was exactly what I intended. My mother then took the phone, her voice trembling. "How could you exclude your own parents? We're family!" she cried. A bitter laugh escaped me. "Family?" I echoed. "You mean the same family you left out when you decided to get married without telling a soul?" The line went dead quiet, and for a moment I thought they'd hung up. Then my father snarled, "That was different. We had our reasons." I steadied my breathing, remembering how painful it had been to find out secondhand. "And we have ours," I replied quietly. "Consider this an object lesson in how it feels to be kept outside the loop." My mother began to sob, saying something about ungrateful, but I felt only a grim sense of finality. Years of pent-up frustration spilled into each syllable I spoke. They had played the victim, painting me as disrespectful. Now they were tasting the consequences of their own betrayal. Before either could speak again, I ended the call, tears burning my eyes. This was the brutal side of revenge. It left no room for easy reconciliation. But I'd had enough of bending to their whims. This time, I stood. After hanging up, I remained there, staring at the setting sun. My hands shook, and my heart felt like it might beat out of my chest. I wasn't sure if I was about to collapse or burst into triumphant laughter. A strange mixture of sorrow and liberation coursed through me. It struck me then how quickly life can flip, leaving you both vindicated and hollow. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? I wanted them to feel that same sting of exclusion. Well, they felt it now, but nothing about it was satisfying. I wiped my eyes and rejoined the gathering. My grandparents instantly noticed my shaken expression. They ushered me to a quiet corner where I relayed the phone conversation. Both sets nodded grimly, sharing my conflicted feelings. We clinked glasses in a silent toast to standing up for ourselves, even if it hurt. Soon, the music drew us back, and I let myself dance with cousins and friends, forcing the pain aside for a brief reprieve. Around midnight, the party began to wind down. People retreated to their lodgings, weary but content. I lingered under the canopy of stars with my grandparents, wondering what awaited us next. "Do you think they'll ever come around?" I asked quietly. My paternal grandmother sighed, dabbing at her eyes. "I hope so, but I won't hold my breath." We stood there in silence, acknowledging that our act of retribution had drawn a line in the sand. If my parents wanted back in our lives, they'd have to swallow their pride and offer real remorse. It was a heavy truth, but also necessary. When I finally went to bed, my mind reeled with visions of their anger, our confrontation, and the uncertain future. I clutched the blankets tightly, torn between regret and relief. In the days that followed, I expected an onslaught of phone calls or texts, but there was only silence. My parents seemed to vanish into their own world, licking wounds or building walls. Meanwhile, I returned to my routine, my editing job, nights spent reading or out with friends. Yet nothing felt quite the same. A heavy weight of finality clung to me, making each breath feel both freer and more somber. Occasionally, I'd catch myself scrolling through old photos, searching for some hint that this rift could be repaired. But the memory of their secret wedding still gnawed at me, reminding me that trust was broken the moment they chose to exclude everyone. About a week after the reunion, my grandmother on my father's side called to check on me. I admitted I felt both justified and guilty, and she soothed my turmoil with gentle words. "You did what you needed to do," she said. "If your parents can't see their own role in this, that's on them." I held on to that reassurance like a lifeline. Over the next few months, I threw myself into work, earning a promotion that gave me more creative freedom. My social circle expanded, and I found I had more emotional energy to invest in true friendships once I wasn't expending it on chasing my parents' approval. My grandparents remained a steadfast presence. We gathered for dinners, watched old movies, and occasionally reminisced about the family reunion with a mix of pride and sorrow. Slowly, I realized I no longer needed to justify my choice. What's done was done. The ball was in my parents' court if they ever wanted to bridge the gap. In protecting my dignity, I'd found a sense of self-worth that no amount of manipulation or guilt could ever erase. Then, about 6 months later, an unexpected envelope arrived in my mailbox. The handwriting was my father's, neat and distinct. Inside was a brief letter, less than a page long. My chest tightened as I read his words. He wrote that they regretted how everything had unfolded, yet the letter offered no true apology. Instead, it urged me to remember where your loyalty lies and reminded me that family should stand together. He closed by saying they hoped I'd drop my grudge. My hands shook with anger and disappointment. The tone was so condescending, as though I were a wayward child. No ownership of their secret wedding, no acknowledgement of the hurt they'd caused. I set the letter aside and deliberated for days. Part of me wanted to rip it to shreds and be done. Another part was tempted to meet them halfway, hoping we could rebuild some semblance of normalcy. But how could I trust people who felt entitled to my forgiveness without recognizing the gravity of their deception? Finally, I penned a response. I thanked them for reaching out, but made it clear I wouldn't move forward until they accepted their role in this fiasco. I pressed the letter into the mailbox with trembling resolve, uncertain whether it would kindle a genuine change or ignite another battle. Weeks passed, and I heard nothing. Their silence spoke volumes. If they truly sought reconciliation, they'd have to do better than vague entreaties. My grandparents supported my stance, insisting I had every right to guard my heart. Although it hurt, I was done granting them second chances at my expense. I refused to be the child they conveniently forgot whenever it suited them. My life was calmer without their constant demands. There was a bittersweet peace in knowing I was free. As more time passed, I focused on healing and forging my own path. My grandparents remained central to my life. We celebrated birthdays together, took small trips, and even dived into genealogy projects to uncover more of our family's history. The more I learned, the more I treasured the extended family that had embraced me so wholeheartedly at the reunion. My parents' absence still cut deep, but at least I knew where we stood. One afternoon, while sifting through old photos with my paternal grandfather, he came across an album from my childhood. Flipping through pages, I noticed how happy we all looked. "You were the light of their lives," my grandfather murmured, but somewhere along the line, they forgot how to show it. His words resonated, reminding me that people can love in deeply flawed ways. Still, love doesn't excuse disrespect or betrayal. Over the following year, my grandparents subtly kept tabs on my parents, informing me that my father's health wasn't great and my mother was struggling with loneliness. They'd apparently grown bitter and resentful, placing blame on everyone but themselves. It was hard to watch from a distance, knowing I couldn't fix what they refused to acknowledge. Sometimes I felt guilt gnaw at me. Other times I felt relief that I was no longer ensnared by their dramas. The grandparents urged me not to lose myself in pity. They reiterated that I deserved honest relationships. And so I pressed on, forging a future built on mutual respect, determined never to repeat their mistakes. Each new milestone in my life, small or big, was shared with the family that chose me, that stood by me when I needed them most. My parents had made their bed, and unless they owned up to their betrayal, I saw no reason to disturb those covers. Looking back, I see a transformation in myself I never thought possible. Once, I craved my parents' approval like oxygen. Now, I breathe freely without it. Their secret wedding was more than just a slight. It was a catalyst that forced me to draw boundaries. The revenge we enacted, organizing that grand reunion and locking them out, felt justified, a mirror reflecting their own betrayal back upon them. Its aftermath wasn't neat or pretty, but I discovered a core of strength I'd never known I possessed. I still have the photo album my grandfather compiled to commemorate that day. Every so often, I flip through it, recalling the music, the laughter, the bittersweet taste of standing up for myself. I'm not naive enough to believe everything is settled. My parents might someday attempt another reconciliation, or they might cling to anger. Either way, I've learned that forgiveness isn't a doormat to be walked on. It's a choice, one I can make if I see genuine remorse. Until then, I stand firm in the knowledge that my worth doesn't hinge on their acceptance. Ultimately, I have no regrets about giving them a taste of their own medicine. Some betrayals deserve no easy pardon, and as for me, I'm stronger, freer, and more certain of my place in the world than ever before. The child who once begged for scraps of attention is gone. In their place stands someone who knows exactly what she deserves and refuses to settle for less. If my parents wanted an obedient audience, they should have thought twice before shutting me out of their wedding. Because once I learned to shut the door, I realized I never needed their hollow love in the first place. Self-respect is a ruthless teacher, but it's also the sweetest revenge on betrayal, peace. I remember the day Owen moved in with us like it happened this morning. There was a cold, bitter wind outside as my wife, Clarissa, ushered him through our front door. She told me his recovery wouldn't take longer than a month or two, but I braced myself for a longer stint the moment I saw him hobble in on crutches. Owen had always been that sort of man who liked to test the patience of everyone around him, and I never could stand his smug behavior. We'd known each other for years, circling the same social events because of Clarissa's friend group. He was the loudest in the room, always had to be the star. Everything about him rubbed me the wrong way. Truth be told, I never wanted him in our house. But Clarissa insisted, tears welling in her eyes, claiming we had enough space and that family, albeit distant, should look after each other. Owen wasn't technically family, but he had grown up next door to Clarissa's cousins and had become practically a fixture in her extended circle. My reluctance only grew after he set his single bag in our guest room and immediately started bossing me around about how he liked his coffee. I resolved to show patience, reminding myself that I'd promised Clarissa we'd help him get back on his feet. At the time, I had no idea how a short-term favor would morph into a nightmare that threatened to break my entire world apart. As the weeks rolled by, I found myself aggravated by Owen's lingering presence. He was no jobless vagrant, he had a steady position in an accounting firm, but the accident had left him temporarily unable to commute. Clarissa, ever the optimist, volunteered our place because we were closer to the city hospital. I tried to be polite, but every morning we'd have some friction. He complained about the cold floors or the eggs not being runny enough. He never once said thank you. On top of that, he had this uncanny ability to charm Clarissa into defending him. He'd spin his complaints in such a way that left me looking like the unreasonable one. I clenched my jaw and quietly waited for his cast to come off. One night, about 4 weeks in, I was drifting off to sleep when Clarissa started talking about the future. She whispered, "I think we should consider having a baby." My heart sped up. We'd been married 7 years, and while the subject of children had surfaced casually, it had never been a pressing issue for us. My job at the warehouse paid decently, but we lived in an expensive area, and Clarissa worked as a dental assistant. We'd always put off kids until we felt more financially stable. But that night, she was so insistent. Her eyes sparkled with possibility as she talked about how having Owen around made her realize she wanted to help someone else, to nurture new life. I, half asleep, just nodded. Time blurred, and Owen's cast was removed a few days after Christmas. I thought that meant he'd move out soon, but he always seemed to find a new excuse to stay. First, it was that he still needed physical therapy. Then he had a shift in job responsibilities that required him to be in town for more frequent doctor visits. Clarissa kept saying we couldn't just throw him out. Every day, my patience eroded a bit more. He'd lounge on our couch, hog the TV, and ask Clarissa to fetch him water or fluff his pillows. I'd come home from work to find them laughing together or poring over old family photos. It felt wrong, like I was stuck outside my own house looking in. One Sunday afternoon, I was working on our car in the driveway when Owen sauntered out, no crutches in sight, and asked if I needed help. His tone dripped with condescension, but I tried to keep my cool. I handed him a wrench, and he fumbled it before making some joke about how not everyone is born to fix engines. I forced a laugh and continued my work. Minutes later, Clarissa appeared. She had that thoughtful, borderline anxious look on her face. She said, "We need to talk," and ushered me to the living room. Owen followed, arms folded, sporting a smug grin that made my stomach churn. I couldn't imagine what was about to come out of her mouth. In the living room, Clarissa's voice trembled slightly as she explained that she and Owen had been discussing my reluctance to have a baby. She said she wanted one sooner rather than later, that she was feeling time slip away, and that we shouldn't wait any longer. I listened, feeling blindsided. I hadn't realized how urgent she felt about this. Then she dropped the real bomb. She wanted Owen to help us. I blinked, failing to comprehend for a moment. She insisted it was purely practical. Some test results for my fertility had suggested a low sperm count. She was certain she wanted to conceive naturally, not involve clinics or procedures. The madness of it all left me momentarily speechless. Anger surged through my veins. I stood up, trembling, and shouted, "Absolutely not!" My voice cracked, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I was not going to let Owen father a child with my wife. Clarissa stared at me like I was an alien. Owen put on a sympathetic face, though there was something in his eyes that hinted at satisfaction. He said, "I understand how you feel, man, but Clarissa's only trying to do what's best for your family." That single sentence nearly made me explode. My family, as far as I was concerned, did not include him. I stormed out of the living room, slamming the front door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest. I spent that night in a haze of disbelief. The next morning, Clarissa barely spoke to me. She sulked around the kitchen, brewing coffee and avoiding eye contact. I wanted to talk, to figure out how we'd gotten here, but every time I tried, she cut me off. Finally, after Owen left for a physical therapy appointment, she confronted me, calling me selfish. She said I was denying her the chance to be a mother just because of my insecurities. Her words stung deep. I reminded her that I wanted children, but I could not fathom raising a child that was biologically Owen's. The betrayal and disrespect felt insurmountable. She refused to see it that way, insisting that biology was secondary to love. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in our house grew impossible to ignore. Owen's presence now felt oppressive. I could see him watching me sometimes with this guarded curiosity, as though he was waiting to see if I'd snap. Clarissa walked around like a ghost, hardly smiling, constantly sighing. Meanwhile, I withdrew into my own world, volunteering for extra shifts at the warehouse just to stay out of the house. My rage simmered under the surface every time I watched Owen share an inside joke with my wife or coax a grin out of her. I started to wonder if this was more than just a plan for a baby. Was there something deeper between them, something that had grown behind my back? One evening, I came home late and found Owen alone in the kitchen, finishing a glass of water. Clarissa had gone to bed early. He leaned against the counter, regarding me with an expression I could only describe as pity. Then he said something I never expected. "I agree with you, you know. This baby idea is messed up. I froze, the tension in the air palpable. He sighed and set the empty glass down. Clarissa's heart is in the right place, but this scenario is just too complicated, especially for you. She thinks it's a simple solution, but I realize it's more than that. I didn't know how to respond. Hearing him validate my feelings was the last thing I anticipated. I wanted to ask him a million questions, but all that came out was a blunt, "So, why do you keep encouraging her?" He shrugged, staring at the floor. At first, I thought maybe it would be an interesting arrangement. I don't have a family of my own, but the more I see how much it tears you apart, the more I realize it's not fair. I told her as much, but she won't listen to me. I stood there, stunned. Could it be that Owen wasn't the villain I'd made him out to be? For a moment, a flicker of sympathy for him sparked, but it was quickly smothered by years of resentment. I simply nodded, then walked away to our bedroom. That night, I confronted Clarissa. I told her I'd spoken to Owen and that he wasn't even on board with this plan anymore. She glared at me, tears in her eyes, and insisted I must have misunderstood. I pressed her, demanding to know why she was so fixated on Owen being the father. Why not a donor bank if we were going to consider alternatives? Her voice broke as she confessed that part of her always felt drawn to him, that maybe deep down, she believed he would be the best candidate to give her a healthy baby. My chest tightened. It was a betrayal on every level. In that moment, I realized this was no mere solution to fertility problems. It was personal. I ended up sleeping on the couch, furious and torn. My mind raced with all the possible scenarios. Did she love him? Was it just lust, some primal attraction she wouldn't admit to? The next morning, I woke to find Clarissa gone. She'd left a note saying she needed space and would be at her sister's. Owen was nowhere to be seen either, which only fueled my paranoid imagination. I considered calling her, but my anger was too raw. Instead, I paced the empty house, remembering all the times I'd tried to make her happy. We'd dreamed about traveling, buying a small summer cottage by the lake, hosting family parties. Now, that life felt like it was crumbling beneath me. 2 days passed in that fog of uncertainty. Finally, Clarissa returned, looking exhausted and puffy-eyed. She said she'd done some thinking and wanted to approach this differently. She apologized for hurting me, for demanding that Owen be the father. I felt a wave of relief, thinking maybe we could salvage our marriage if we found another path. But she still refused to give up on the idea of having a baby soon. I suggested fertility treatments, adoption, anything that didn't involve Owen. We had a tense discussion, but ultimately, she agreed. I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. Perhaps we could move forward, find a new plan that respected us both. That same night, Clarissa told Owen the baby conversation was off the table. In the days that followed, Owen seemed subdued, almost introspective. He no longer made snide remarks about how I grilled the burgers or how I organized the living room. He thanked me if I handed him something and even tried to pay rent. I refused the money, mostly because I wanted him gone, not lingering with an additional excuse to stay. But a strange civility settled between us. I didn't trust it entirely, but for the sake of my marriage, I tried to keep the peace. Clarissa and I began looking into fertility specialists. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same team again. I prayed that perhaps we'd weathered the worst of this crisis. One afternoon, I came home early and found the house quiet. Clarissa's car wasn't in the driveway, so I figured she was at work or running errands. I headed to the guest room to see if Owen was around, intending to ask him about any leads on an apartment he might be considering. The door was ajar, and I saw him speaking in hushed tones on his phone. He sounded agitated. I lingered a moment, curiosity getting the better of me. What I heard made my blood run cold. I don't care what Clarissa thinks she wants. I'm not going to be tied down here forever. She can't keep forcing this baby idea on me if I'm not comfortable. I'm not her backup plan. Then he paused and lowered his voice even more. No, trust me, I have a way out. She's too blind to see what's really going on. I backed away, a knot of confusion and anger twisting in my gut. So he'd never truly intended to follow through with Clarissa's plan, or maybe he'd changed his mind and was now trying to escape. Either way, I was done playing nice. I felt like a fool, letting him remain under our roof when he was clearly manipulating the situation for his own ends. I spent the rest of the day trying to calm my rage, reminding myself that Clarissa was the person I needed to talk to. She arrived home late, offering a small wave, but I just pulled her aside and told her we needed to have a serious conversation. My heart thundered as I prepared to expose Owen's deceit. But that very night, something happened that changed the course of everything. Around midnight, I jolted awake to Clarissa screaming in the hallway. I ran out of our bedroom and saw her clutching her arm, tears streaming down her face. Owen stood nearby, looking guilty and shocked. He said, voice quivering, "We were arguing. I tried to stop her from slamming the door." She pulled away and her arm got caught. Clarissa glared at him, fury in her eyes. She spat. "He grabbed me!" I rushed to her side, my protective instincts roaring to life. Her arm was already bruising. She kept accusing him of assault, while he stammered out denials, saying it was an accident. But I knew I'd had enough. I helped Clarissa into the car and drove her to the ER to have her arm checked. The doctor said it wasn't broken, but a sprain was possible. I watched her grimace in pain, seething inside at Owen. This was the final straw, no matter how the story played out. She insisted she didn't want to press charges, but as far as I was concerned, there was no going back. Owen wasn't going to step foot in our home again. By the time we returned, the sun was rising. I marched through the front door, half expecting to find Owen gone, but he was in the living room, pacing like a restless animal. The moment he saw us, he tried to apologize. I told him to pack his things immediately. Clarissa, her eyes red from crying, nodded in agreement. Owen started to protest, but I cut him off with a cold stare. "You have 1 hour to get out, or I'll call the police myself." He slumped, anger etched across his face, but he retreated to the guest room. As Clarissa sank into the sofa, I knelt beside her. I asked her what had happened, but she only sobbed that she'd been a fool, that she'd gotten tangled up in an idea that had gone too far. I ran my hand through her hair, wanting to comfort her, but also feeling betrayed. It would take time to mend the rift, if it was even possible. When Owen left, I thought that would be the end of it. Clarissa and I spent the next week trying to rebuild trust. We sought counseling sessions, addressed our communication issues, and started researching fertility clinics more seriously. We forced ourselves to talk about everything, my insecurities, her need for motherhood, the wedge Owen had driven between us. Little by little, it seemed we were healing. Then, one evening, I returned from work to find Clarissa pale and trembling in the living room, a letter in her hands. It was from Owen's lawyer, claiming that Clarissa had assaulted him first and that he was considering legal action to cover his so-called medical expenses. My blood boiled. I crumpled the letter, feeling a red mist behind my eyes. I immediately called a lawyer friend of mine to see what we could do. He advised us to remain calm and not to contact Owen directly, but I couldn't let it go. That arrogant man had invaded my house, tried to father a child with my wife, and then physically hurt her, yet he had the audacity to spin it against us. Late that night, as Clarissa tried to sleep, I sat in the kitchen seething, imagining how I could make him pay. My mind returned to the moment he was on the phone talking about some way out and how Clarissa was blind. He was clearly plotting something even then. There would be no forgiveness from me, only retribution. Over the next few days, I dug into everything I knew about Owen. I knew he had a shaky financial history, rumors of gambling debts, some questionable dealings. He was always playing big at the poker table during social gatherings. I managed to reach out to a couple of acquaintances who confirmed that Owen owed substantial money to people who didn't appreciate late payments. Fueled by anger, I discreetly contacted one of those individuals and hinted that Owen had recently come into a large sum of insurance money. I also offered them his new address, which I'd gleaned from a text Clarissa had on her phone. It was a risky move, but I was too furious to consider the consequences carefully. A few days later, we got a follow-up letter from Owen's lawyer indicating that the claim was being dropped due to lack of evidence and personal circumstances. I let out a dark chuckle, imagining how the debt collectors might have paid Owen a visit, scaring him away from any costly legal battles. Clarissa seemed relieved, and though she asked how it all went away, I just told her we got lucky. Privately, I smiled at the knowledge that I'd orchestrated a silent revenge. Owen would never see my fingerprints on it, and he'd have no reason to come back into our lives. I felt a cold satisfaction, sure that my plan had forced him to back down. Clarissa and I continued our counseling, forging a shaky path toward reconciliation. We went to fertility clinics, started exploring options like IVF, and tried to put Owen's specter behind us. Our relationship wasn't the same, but we were learning to communicate better, to trust again. Still, in my quiet moments, I held on to the bitterness, the memory of how he had nearly broken us apart. Eventually, one of our fertility cycles took, and Clarissa's test came back positive. The night we found out, we clung to each other, crying tears of relief. I whispered, "He's gone. We made it." And in my heart, I knew I had no regrets. Some betrayals never deserve forgiveness. Sometimes, only revenge will suffice. I remember the evening my fiancé, Shane, stomped into our apartment, his face red and his voice shaking with fury. We'd been engaged only a few months, but I had never seen him so unhinged. He tossed his work bag on the floor and glared at me, mumbling about how they had dared to do it again. I didn't know who they were or what exactly had happened, so I sat him down on the couch. That's when he told me about the humiliating award ceremony his boss, Rhonda, had sprung on him despite his request for no public praise. He'd warned Rhonda repeatedly that he loathed public attention, explaining how past experiences had made him uncomfortable with displays of praise. She seemed to understand until she blindsided him at work. They'd gathered his entire team, ordered a cake, and presented him with a plaque. Shane reacted with anger instead of gratitude, glaring at everyone before walking out. That afternoon, he told me, "I said I never wanted an award show. Now they're treating me like a child who needs applause." I could see how humiliated he felt. He believed Rhonda had violated his trust and crossed an unbreakable line. Over the next week, Shane's workplace became tense. Rumors circulated about his furious exit. Rhonda tried to smooth things over, but Shane was uninterested in mending fences. He kept conversations minimal, refusing even her attempts at private apologies. "Words mean nothing," he said. "If she cared, she would have respected my boundaries." I worried about his job. He was a brilliant project manager, beloved for his expertise, but his attitude now threatened to alienate everyone. I suggested he speak to human resources, but he just shook his head. "They're all in on it," he insisted, convinced he'd been deliberately set up. When rumors of a possible promotion surfaced, Shane assumed his stellar performance would outweigh any lingering tension. He'd led successful projects, delivered results on time, and maintained impeccable client satisfaction. Word around the office suggested that a new senior project manager position was opening. People believed he was the logical choice. However, the day came when the announcement named someone else, Damon, a younger colleague Shane had mentored. Stunned, Shane approached Rhonda, who delivered a rehearsed explanation. "Damon has demonstrated strong leadership qualities." Shane seethed, certain his refusal to accept that public award had cost him the promotion he deserved. That night, he came home livid, ranting about betrayal and favoritism. I tried to soothe him, reminding him that he could look for opportunities elsewhere, but he wouldn't hear it. "It's the principle," he snapped. "I've given them everything, and they trampled my dignity." He flung his jacket across the room, pacing back and forth. I'd never seen him so consumed with anger. He muttered about legal action, threatening a lawsuit for retaliation. I suggested he calm down and gather evidence first, but he ignored me. "They're messing with the wrong guy," he said, eyes dark with unwavering determination. As tensions at work escalated, Shane's relationship with Damon soured too. Damon attempted a polite approach, claiming he never sought to overshadow Shane, yet Shane refused any civil conversation, believing Damon had backstabbed him. When an internal memo circulated, listing Damon's responsibilities, Shane exploded. He confronted Rhonda in the hallway, calling her a liar and accusing her of orchestrating a smear campaign against him. The atmosphere became untenable. Shane came home one night, tossed his laptop onto the couch, and declared he'd resigned. "I refuse to let them disrespect me anymore," he said, shaking with both rage and sorrow. Suddenly, he was out of work, and our future plans wavered. We had hoped to combine finances for a new home after the wedding, but now everything felt uncertain. Shane insisted it was temporary. He'd find a better position, maybe even sue his former employer for damages. "They owe me," he insisted. In the meantime, he gave up his own small condo to save on costs, opting to crash on my couch. I offered him the spare room, but he refused, saying he didn't want to disrupt my routine. Still, it felt strange seeing my fiancé in such a precarious state. At first, I tried to be supportive. I believed his rage would subside once he got back on his feet. But every day, Shane sank deeper into resentment. He spent hours scanning job boards and reading legal forums, searching for angles to punish his old company. Nights turned into sleepless marathons of drafting demand letters and compiling evidence of perceived slights. He slammed coffee cups onto the table, mumbled curses at Rhonda's name, and bristled at any suggestion that he move on. I worried about his mental health, afraid that his bitterness would consume him before he found a path forward. He found a lawyer willing to explore a potential lawsuit, but it wasn't the slam dunk Shane hoped for. The attorney explained the need for concrete evidence of retaliation. A meltdown over a public award wouldn't automatically guarantee a win. Shane bristled at the advice to maintain composure. "I can't pretend to be okay with what they did," he spat. Nonetheless, he proceeded with an initial consultation, handing over emails, texts, and corporate memos he believed showed a pattern of disrespect. When the lawyer expressed caution, Shane felt betrayed again. He muttered, "Seems like everyone's in bed with that damn company." Financial stress soon followed. My paycheck barely covered rent, utilities, and groceries. Shane contributed when he could, but his savings dwindled. He applied for jobs, yet rumors spread fast in the local tech scene, and no offers materialized. He blamed Rhonda for ruining his reputation. I started picking up freelance work, trying to keep us afloat. Meanwhile, Shane's fixation on revenge intensified. If anyone suggested moving forward, he saw it as disloyalty. "I won't forgive betrayal," he'd say, his voice razor sharp. It was as though the Shane I fell in love with had been replaced by a man consumed by anger. One morning, I awoke to find him hunched over his laptop, eyes bloodshot. He'd been researching corporate legal cases all night. "They've messed with the wrong man," he said quietly. He'd discovered a clause in his employment contract that could hint at wrongful termination, even though he'd technically resigned. His attorney was skeptical, but Shane insisted on pressing forward. When I voiced concern, he snapped, "You should be on my side. Don't you want justice?" I tried reminding him that justice wouldn't pay our bills, but he glared at me as if I were betraying him just like everyone else. He filed the lawsuit, citing constructive discharge, emotional distress, and retaliatory exclusion from advancement. The firm responded aggressively, denying every allegation. Their lawyers targeted Shane's outburst during the award ceremony, calling him volatile and unfit for leadership. It was a painful process, with depositions revealing emails from coworkers who found Shane's behavior intimidating. Even though I believed he had a valid complaint, the mounting evidence that painted him as difficult was hard to ignore. Still, Shane remained resolute, fueled by righteous indignation. His attorney warned him to expect personal scrutiny on the stand, but Shane declared he had nothing to hide. A pre-trial mediation session was scheduled, meant to avoid a lengthy courtroom battle. I accompanied Shane, hoping for a settlement that might let us reclaim normalcy. But negotiations soured quickly. The company's representatives offered a modest sum, contingent on a non-disclosure agreement. Shane refused, demanding a formal apology and a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The lawyers laughed, which only inflamed him. He stormed out, vowing to drag them through a public trial. I felt a mix of dread and admiration at his refusal to accept compromise. He valued his self-respect above all else, even if it meant risking everything. Back at home, the tension between us grew. Our conversations revolved around his court case or his anger at Damon's betrayal. He refused to consider that Damon might simply have been promoted for being more adaptable. "He stabbed me in the back," Shane insisted, convinced Damon had spoken negatively about him behind closed doors. Late one night, Shane discovered an old group email implying Damon supported Rhonda's public award idea. That was all the proof Shane needed to brand Damon a traitor. "I mentored that guy," he muttered bitterly. "No forgiveness for betrayal, none. I hope he regrets ever crossing me." The trial date loomed, intensifying Shane's obsession. He spent sleepless nights compiling documents, practicing testimonies, and dissecting every possible argument. Gregory, his lawyer, tried to temper his client's fury, but Shane was unstoppable. He believed he was fighting a moral crusade, and that anyone not fully aligned with him was an enemy. Our wedding plans had withered, replaced by court deadlines and legal fees. My own emotions vacillated between empathy for his situation and frustration at his inability to see beyond revenge. When I broached the topic of our future, he brushed me off, saying, "This is our future, me winning." On the morning of the trial, Shane wore his best suit, a grim determination etched into his face. I sat in the gallery, stomach twisted in knots. The company's representatives arrived with thick binders and an air of calm superiority. Damon was there too, avoiding Shane's glare. Rhonda, stoic, nodded politely to her attorneys. Opening statements framed Shane as a victim of corporate retaliation, but the defense countered by highlighting his disruptive outbursts. They alleged he'd made colleagues uncomfortable, undermining the company culture. Shane fumed at each accusation, arms folded tight. I could almost taste the tension permeating the room. When Damon testified, he described Shane as a brilliant technician but a rigid personality. He insisted that management valued Shane's skills, yet worried about his leadership approach. Shane seethed, whispering lies under his breath. Damon admitted Shane had helped him grow, but claimed the award incident showed how poorly Shane handled public acknowledgement. It was a stark portrayal of Shane as thin-skinned and prone to hostility. My fiancé glowered, fists clenched beneath the table. I watched him wrestle with shock and anger. Damon's words felt like a gut punch, a stark reminder that personal grudges wouldn't disappear simply through legal channels. Next, Rhonda took the stand, describing how she intended the award as recognition for Shane's excellent work. She seemed genuinely baffled by his fury, alleging she had wanted to boost his morale. Shane's lawyer tried to portray her actions as deliberate provocation, but Rhonda insisted she never meant harm. The defense produced emails where Shane flatly refused team-building activities, painting him as unwilling to collaborate. Watching Shane's face contort, I recognized how deeply he felt this betrayal. The question hung in the air: was this truly retaliation, or simply a clash between Shane's unwavering pride and a company's public culture? At the close of testimonies, Shane took the stand, recounting how he felt cornered and humiliated by the surprise ceremony. He described a pattern of disrespect, culminating in a rigged promotion process. He spoke passionately, voice cracking at times, about boundaries and dignity. Yet, under cross-examination, the defense highlighted instances where Shane had refused to attend corporate events or even basic staff meetings. They argued that a leadership role demanded public engagement, something Shane clearly detested. When asked if he regretted his outburst, Shane refused to back down, insisting he was justified. The jury watched, faces inscrutable, absorbing every word. After closing arguments, I waited with Shane for the verdict, nerves on edge. He sat upright, jaw clenched, still convinced he'd win. The jury returned, looking solemn. The foreperson declared the company not liable for retaliation. They found no conclusive link between the award incident and Shane's missed promotion. Instead, they believed his poor attitude and hostility had influenced management's decision. My heart sank seeing Shane's face fall. He stood motionless, a statue of disbelief. The judge dismissed the case, leaving Shane with nothing. All those sleepless nights, all that anger, had culminated in a single, devastating defeat. In the aftermath, Shane refused to speak to reporters, refusing even my comfort. Gregory tried offering condolences, but Shane stormed out of the courtroom. Later that evening, he paced around my living room, vowing payback. "They'll regret this," he hissed. "I'm not through." Fear clutched my chest. I knew that look. He was past reason, driven by vengeance. Over the following days, he combed through old company files, rummaging for anything incriminating. "I'm going to take them down," he said, face pale with exhaustion. I begged him to let go, to start anew, but he couldn't. Betrayal, in his mind, demanded consequences. One night, I woke to the glow of his laptop. Shane had hacked into the company's internal server, pulling confidential financial data. He claimed he found evidence of embezzlement tied to Damon's projects. I froze, horrified at the illegality of it. "They deserve this," he growled. "They tried to destroy me." He compiled spreadsheets, emails, and suspicious transactions, certain this would ruin Damon and Rhonda. Despite my pleas, he refused to delete the files. "No forgiveness," he said, eyes cold. "They crushed my career. Now I'll watch them burn." My protests fell on deaf ears. He was too far gone. Days later, an anonymous tip reached local journalists, detailing financial discrepancies within Shane's former company. Rumors exploded online, stock prices dipped, and an internal audit began. Damon was suspended, and Rhonda faced serious scrutiny. Shane watched the fallout with a grim smile, as if justice were finally his. I felt sick, torn between horror at his methods and relief that the company might answer for unethical behavior. Yet, I worried for Shane's soul. seeing how revenge had eclipsed every other aspect of his life. Any affection we once shared was overshadowed by his relentless drive to hurt those he deemed enemies. Investigations revealed Damon had orchestrated fraudulent vendor contracts, siphoning funds while Rhonda turned a blind eye. Both were terminated. Legal action loomed for them, and the company suffered a blow to its reputation. Shane took it all in, triumphant, as though he'd scored a personal victory. But I saw no sign of relief in his eyes. He still paced restlessly, consumed by suspicion that someone would discover his hacking. Sometimes he'd stare at me as though I'd betrayed him simply by questioning his actions. Our relationship felt beyond repair, a casualty of the ruthless path he'd chosen for revenge. One evening, I confronted him, demanding he seek therapy, or at least consider the toll this crusade was taking on us. He scoffed, "I'm fine, I won." But he hadn't won anything that truly mattered. He'd lost his job, his professional reputation, and was close to losing me. "Don't you see what you're doing?" I cried. "They crossed a line," he replied. "I can't forgive that." He didn't understand forgiveness wasn't about them. It was about his own healing, but he was determined to remain bitter. I realized that the man I loved was drowning in anger, unwilling to surface. As the scandal deepened, the company's leadership was overhauled. Lawsuits stacked against Damon and Rhonda, overshadowing Shane's initial claims of retaliation. In a twisted turn, the public forgot about him. The press focused on corporate fraud, not the meltdown that started it all. "They've stolen my narrative," he fumed. "I should be seen as the hero who exposed them." I tried pointing out how his life might finally regain stability without the spotlight. He scoffed, calling me naive. He was still sleeping on the couch, still refusing to plan our wedding, still convinced everyone had betrayed him. I felt helpless. Late one night, after another argument, Shane announced he was leaving. "Clearly, you don't support me," he snarled, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag. I didn't stop him. The man I'd fallen in love with, proud, principled, caring, had vanished under layers of resentment. He slammed the door behind him, leaving me in a silent living room littered with legal papers and bitter memories. For weeks, I heard nothing. When mutual friends asked about him, I had no answers. My own grief was compounded by relief that the constant darkness was gone. I needed light, and I wouldn't find it with Shane. Months passed before I heard an update. A mutual friend mentioned Shane was couch surfing with an old colleague, obsessed with launching another lawsuit against the company for defamation. It never materialized. No lawyer wanted his case after the jury's verdict. He'd become a cautionary tale of unchecked pride and anger. Meanwhile, I cleaned up my life, attending therapy, focusing on work, and rediscovering joy. I recognized that I'd loved him deeply, but love alone couldn't heal a soul bent on destruction. The phone rang once, Shane rambling about how he'd find justice. I quietly ended the call, wishing him peace. I often wonder if he found solace in tearing others down, or if that bitterness eventually consumed him. Perhaps he wandered into another job, continuing the pattern of grudges. In truth, I no longer want vengeance on his behalf. I want freedom. From the anger, from the memory of betrayal, from the heartbreak of watching someone unravel. Our engagement lies in ashes, a reminder that respect for oneself can turn cruel when it abandons empathy. Let this stand as proof that no victory born of spite ever truly satisfies. Shane chose never to forgive. In doing so, he forgave himself nothing. I was sitting on the cold metal bench at the airport gate, my carry-on bag resting beside me, bulging with honeymoon essentials I'd spent weeks organizing. The overhead announcements for departing flights rolled by, interspersed with the hum of travelers shuffling from one gate to another. I remember staring down at my phone, the screen's glow reflecting my anxious anticipation. My husband, or so I still thought of him then, was running late. We had planned this trip meticulously, down to the last detail, but I could sense something off. His voice messages from earlier had been clipped and tense, lacking the usual warmth. I tried to ignore the gnawing worry, telling myself everything was fine. I had done my best to appear the picture of calm, though. I wore a new sundress chosen specifically for our island destination, complete with a wide-brimmed hat stuffed into my bag. Every time the gate agent made an announcement, I felt my heart pound a little harder, worried he'd miss boarding entirely. In my head, I kept rehashing the day, the impromptu wedding we'd organized in a rush because we simply couldn't wait. The sweet text messages he'd sent me just a few weeks ago, and the open plane tickets in my name. I tried to focus on that, the love I was sure I felt, an anchor of hope. Then my phone rang. At first, relief washed over me because at least he was alive and presumably on his way. But I sensed a shift in his tone the moment I answered. He sounded breathless, frazzled, and uncharacteristically distant. His words were strangled. He wouldn't be coming after all. I could scarcely process the sentence. I thought it was a joke, an ill-timed prank, or a test of some kind. But he kept talking, spitting out an excuse about an emergency call from his ex that she desperately needed help with something only he could provide. I clutched my phone, numb, disbelief melting into fury. There was no apology, no attempt to salvage the honeymoon. It was like someone had flipped a switch, turning off the sweet, loving man I had married just days ago. He kept talking, voice frantic, explaining that this was urgent, that he had to be there, that he couldn't just ignore her crisis. My heart hammered in my chest, and I looked around at the families and couples milling about, uncomfortably aware of how exposed and humiliated I felt. I asked him how he could do this now, on the day we were supposed to board our flight to paradise. His response was cold, mechanical. "I'm sorry, I just can't come." I stared at my boarding pass, the letters and numbers now meaningless. In that moment, I remembered every sacrifice I'd made in the last few months. I'd changed my living arrangements, compromised on wedding details that he insisted upon, even restructured my finances to accommodate our shared future. And now, standing there under the fluorescent lights of the airport terminal, I felt the kind of shock that slows time to a standstill. My mind raced with questions. Did he still love her? How long had he been waiting for this opportunity? Was I just a convenient placeholder until his ex reappeared? I ended the call without another word, a trembling hand pressed to my forehead. Everything around me blurred. The row of airport restaurants, the overhead screens, the check-in counters, it all became a backdrop for the raw betrayal sinking into my bones. My chest tightened as if the air had been vacuumed out of the terminal. I was all alone, abandoned before my marriage had even gained traction. People streamed past me, consumed by their own journeys, while I stood motionless in the middle of heartbreak. I walked to the nearest restroom on autopilot, locked myself in a stall, and let out a silent scream. If this was how my marriage was going to start, then I was already done believing in fairy tales. After those first blinding minutes of shock, a cold anger set in. I came out of the stall, washed my face, and stared into my reflection. I saw someone who had always tried to maintain the peace, who had forgiven too easily, who had overlooked minor red flags in the hope that love would conquer all. But at that moment, I resolved not to be that woman anymore. I had no intention of flying to a tropical island alone to mope around in a honeymoon suite meant for two. Nor did I want to slink back home in tears. Something bolder, sharper, awakened inside me. Clutching my phone, I walked out of the restroom and found a quiet corner near a row of payphones no one ever used. My mind was buzzing with possibilities. Should I confront him directly? Storm over to wherever he was and scream my rage to his face? Part of me wanted to do just that, to see the look in his eyes when he realized what he'd thrown away. But then I thought about how he'd so casually cast aside our marriage at the very moment we were about to embark on our honeymoon. There was no remorse, no regret, just a flimsy explanation about an emergency. My anger hardened into resolve. I wouldn't beg, and I wouldn't plead. Let him deal with his so-called emergency. He'd already forfeited any right to my compassion. But I didn't want him to get away with this unscathed. I knew there had to be a consequence, something that would force him to understand the gravity of his betrayal. At the same time, I wanted him to see me flourish, to realize I was not some dependent creature waiting for his scraps of affection. So I canceled our flight tickets, ensuring that any refund or credit would go to me alone. Then I called my bank to freeze our joint accounts, the ones I'd been foolish enough to open. As I gathered my suitcase and headed for the exit, I remembered a conversation we'd had during our brief engagement. He'd boasted about how his ex was unstable, but couldn't let go of him, and he claimed it was all so complicated. I'd been naive then, eager to believe his version of events. That memory ignited a spark of cunning in me. If I wanted to strike back, I needed to know exactly what he was up to. So, instead of heading home, I hopped into a cab and gave the driver an address I never thought I'd have reason to visit. His ex's apartment, a place he'd once shown me from a distance. Outside her building, I paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk, my suitcase at my side, feeling a bit absurd, but I was too furious to let embarrassment stop me. The building itself was old, with paint peeling off the walls and a rusty fire escape clinging to the brick facade. A single street lamp flickered overhead. I had no clue what I'd do if I saw him there. Maybe I'd just watch from a distance, gather ammunition for later use. As the wind whipped at my sundress, I thought of the calm beaches I was supposed to be lying on, sipping cocktails and celebrating my new life. Instead, I was here, on a gritty street. I found a cheap motel across the street, checked in, and dropped my suitcase in a musty room that smelled of stale cigarettes. Then I took up a post near the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. If his ex had demanded he rush over, this was where he'd show up, right? It took a few hours, but just as midnight approached, I saw his familiar silhouette hurry up the steps to her entrance. My heart leapt in my chest, a mix of anger, sorrow, and perverse satisfaction that I'd caught him in the act of running back to her. I felt strangely vindicated, like a detective confirming a suspicion. As lights flickered on in her apartment, I kept watch, alternating between pacing the cramped motel room and sipping water from a plastic cup. My mind raced with questions. Was this really an emergency, or just a convenient excuse to revisit old feelings? Hours went by with no sign of him leaving. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the humiliating phone call. So I took out my notebook, one I always carried for jotting down ideas, and began scribbling notes. Plans for revenge, confessions of heartbreak, half-baked fantasies of exposing him as a cheat. I felt a new clarity in that quiet rage, as though I'd tapped into a hidden reservoir of strength. I had no intention of returning to our shared apartment. Instead, I directed the cab to an old friend's place, Marisol, someone I'd known since college, fiercely loyal and never afraid to speak her mind. She opened her door in a flurry of concern, eyes widening at the sight of my wrinkled dress and the darkness under my eyes. When I told her the story, she swore colorfully in Spanish and engulfed me in a tight hug. Over strong coffee, I recounted everything, from the wedding bliss to the call at the airport. With each word, my resolve solidified. I vowed to show him that betrayal carried a price. Marisol was always full of audacious ideas. She suggested I expose him on social media, telling everyone how he'd abandoned me at the airport for his ex. But as tempting as that was, I wanted something more personal, something that would leave a lasting sting. We brainstormed for hours, batting around various schemes until we settled on one. I knew secrets about him, details of his finances, and vulnerabilities he'd confided in me during our engagement. He'd told me about some questionable dealings at his workplace, how he occasionally bent the rules to get ahead. I remembered it all. If he thought I'd never use it against him, then he truly didn't know me. First, I needed to gather evidence. So I reached out to a trusted acquaintance of mine named Grace, an expert in digital forensics and quietly adept at unearthing secrets. She owed me a favor, and she was more than willing to collect data on his questionable habits. While I waited for her to get back to me, I laid the groundwork for my next move. I began sending him chilly, succinct messages, ignoring his sporadic voicemails claiming he'd explain everything. My plan was to lure him into a false sense of security, to make him think I was too hurt to fight back. Meanwhile, Marisol helped me craft the perfect digital trap. One afternoon, I decided to meet him face to face. It was in a coffee shop near his office, a place where no one would suspect drama. I dressed in a crisp blouse and slacks, projecting a composed exterior despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. He arrived looking weary and defensive, eyeing me as though I might start screaming at any moment. But I stayed calm, letting him speak first. He spewed some excuse about how his ex had threatened self-harm if he didn't come. I could see the guilt in his eyes, but there was also a hint of arrogance. He still believed I might forgive him, that I was too gentle to hold a grudge. I listened with feigned understanding, occasionally nodding as though I sympathized. He reached for my hand across the table, and for a brief moment, I felt a twinge of old love. I remembered our wedding day, the way he'd looked at me with such warmth. But that recollection was quickly extinguished by the memory of him abandoning me. I let him hold my hand just long enough to sense a flicker of hope in him. Then I pulled away, my face unreadable. I told him I needed space to think, and he exhaled in what seemed like relief. If only he knew what kind of thinking I was doing. That evening, Grace called. She had discovered a trove of damning evidence. He wasn't just bending rules at work, He was outright falsifying data to secure lucrative contracts. There were emails, files, and even some hush payments made to keep colleagues quiet. The significance of this revelation sparked two emotions in me: disgust at his unethical behavior and satisfaction at having the perfect leverage. I met up with Grace in a dimly lit bar where we exchanged a folder of printed documents. The gravity of what was inside made my hands tremble, but Marisol, who was with me, squeezed my shoulder, silently reminding me that I was in control. We spent the next day devising a careful plan. I would confront him privately, show him the evidence, and give him a choice: face public exposure or relinquish certain assets and sign divorce papers that were heavily in my favor. It was a sinister gambit, one that part of me loathed sinking to. But the betrayal and humiliation at the airport still burned in my memory, propelling me forward. I refused to let him walk away unscathed. The next night, I arranged to meet him at a small restaurant we used to frequent, a cozy place with booths for some privacy. He arrived with an uncertain smile, looking as though he hoped for reconciliation. I took a moment to observe him, remembering the times I'd been so certain I was in love with him. His hair was a little disheveled, eyes bloodshot, likely from stress. We slid into a corner booth, and I calmly slid the folder across the table. Confusion flashed across his face as he opened it, but it quickly morphed into alarm. His mouth parted in shock. I watched as he thumbed through the pages, emails with suspicious attachments, spreadsheets flagged as falsified, and proof of funds that had mysteriously appeared in his accounts. I could almost taste his panic. Without giving him time to recover, I told him exactly what I wanted: a divorce with generous terms. I wanted full control of our shared assets, and I demanded compensation for the emotional and financial distress he'd caused me. In exchange, I would keep his workplace malfeasance hidden. He tried to sputter excuses, claiming he'd only done it under pressure from some corrupt boss, that he never meant to cross ethical lines. But my expression must have told him there was no wriggling out of this. I was not the forgiving newlywed he had abandoned. A shudder ran through him when he realized I meant every word. He tried to appeal to my love, to my sense of fairness, but that love was buried under layers of betrayal. His eyes welled with tears, a sight that might have once softened my heart. But now, it only reinforced how little respect he had shown me. I stood firm, laid out the documents for the divorce, and gave him a pen. He hesitated, shaking, torn between risking his career and wealth or complying with my demands. With trembling fingers, he finally signed. A weighted silence settled over the table. In that moment, I felt a spark of triumph, but also a twinge of sadness for the person I'd once believed he was. Yet I held on to my convictions, reminding myself of the merciless humiliation I'd felt at the airport, the scorn that had fueled my revenge. I took the papers, packed up the folder, and walked out without a backward glance. Outside, the cool evening air greeted me like a balm. I thought I might feel guilt or remorse, but instead, I felt a surge of pride. I had stood up for myself. I had refused to accept his betrayal and had forced him to understand that actions have consequences. Over the next days, I initiated the legal process, made sure the documents were ironclad, and started to untangle our shared life. The scandal never broke, and I realized that I wouldn't need to ruin his entire career if he complied, but I'd gained something far more precious: self-respect. In the weeks that followed, I moved out of our apartment, ignoring his attempts at contact. I rented a bright, airy loft in a different part of the city, a place with tall windows that let the sunlight pour in each morning. I found a better job that allowed me to travel, something I'd always dreamed of but never pursued, afraid it would clash with his plans. Each day, I woke up feeling a little lighter. The heartbreak was still there, but it was tempered by my sense of justice. Whenever doubt crept in, I remembered how he'd left me stranded at the airport on what should have been our honeymoon, and I felt validated in my decision. In that new life, I discovered unexpected strength, and I vowed never to accept anything less for myself again. I remember vividly the first time I laid eyes on Jonathan. It was the beginning of summer, and I was standing under a blooming maple tree just outside my old office building, waiting for a friend who worked in another department. The sunlight filtering through the leaves gave everything a soft, golden hue. He strolled by in a crisp white shirt, dark suit pants, and a confident smile that immediately disarmed me. A colleague introduced us, and Jonathan extended his hand with genuine warmth. There was something in his gaze, an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person around. In those first moments, a peculiar spark flickered between us, something that made me believe he could become not just someone I dated, but someone who might fill my life with laughter and belonging. We spoke for maybe 5 minutes before my friend arrived, but in that brief exchange, he'd told me about his love for jazz music, a dog he used to foster, and a story about a misadventure in Spain that left me wanting to hear more. We parted ways, each heading back to work, but I felt my heart racing. When my friend teased me about the flush in my cheeks, I just giggled and brushed it off. Deep down, I knew this was the start of something special, though I had no idea how complicated it would become. We began meeting for coffee breaks, harmless chats that slowly grew into lunch dates. The more I learned about him, the more I admired his intelligence, his sense of humor, and the compassion he showed whenever a coworker needed help. He was the type to surprise a receptionist with a small token of gratitude or stay late to assist an intern with a difficult project. Over the next year, our connection deepened into a bona fide romance. There were dinners at cozy bistros, spontaneous weekend getaways, and endless nights talking about our childhoods, our dreams, and our fears. The more time we spent together, the more I felt understood and valued. I thought I'd found the sort of partner who would always stand in my corner, encouraging me to pursue whatever made my soul sing. One night, during a trip to a music festival, Jonathan told me he'd never felt so close to anyone in his life. He whispered that he wanted to grow old with me. I believed him wholeheartedly. What I didn't realize was that his ex-wife, Charlotte, was still a significant presence in his world. He mentioned once that he had been married before, in his early 20s. They had split amicably, or so he claimed. I pictured a polite but distant relationship, the kind where they might exchange holiday cards or the occasional text message. Instead, she was his closest confidant. They shared inside jokes, traveled together at times, and seemed enmeshed in ways I couldn't quite comprehend. When we got engaged, Jonathan casually announced that Charlotte would be his best man. I felt my stomach tighten, but I told myself I was secure enough to handle his unusual friendship. On our wedding day, Charlotte stood at Jonathan's side, resplendent in a tailored tuxedo. She delivered a heartfelt toast about how some people are meant to stay in your life forever, and she ended with a lingering embrace that left me feeling oddly unsettled. But by then, the music was playing, the guests were laughing, and I tried to push down the strange knot in my chest. I thought perhaps this was just the price I had to pay. In the early years of our marriage, I tried to accommodate Jonathan and Charlotte's connection. She would drop by unannounced, often with a bottle of wine, expecting us to include her in whatever plans we had. Sometimes she did laundry at our house, claiming her own machine was broken. Jonathan never questioned it. He seemed thrilled to have her around. Whenever I suggested boundaries, he brushed me off, insisting that Charlotte had nobody else and that I should empathize with her loneliness. Occasionally, I voiced concern. Shouldn't she be making new friends or dating? He waved it away, telling me they had a deep bond. Meanwhile, I felt more like an accessory in their ongoing story than a true partner. I recall an evening when Jonathan was supposed to meet me for dinner at a new restaurant. I waited nearly an hour before he texted that Charlotte's car battery had died. He rushed to her aid, claiming it was an emergency. By the time he showed up, the kitchen had closed. He offered barely an apology, insisting she had no one else to call. I tried to muster understanding, but a deep seed of resentment was planting itself. We argued that night, and though we made up, I began to notice the subtle ways Jonathan prioritized her needs over mine. Charlotte was everywhere. She sent him texts at odd hours asking for advice or a favor. She called on vacations. Every time I tried discussing it calmly, Jonathan insisted I was imagining problems, that I was making mountains out of molehills. I convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting. After all, I had known going in that Charlotte was important to him. The ring on my finger reminded me I was his wife, and so I tried to trust him. I tried for years to be patient. 4, 5, then 10 years passed, and I clung to the idea that marriage required compromise. Charlotte's presence in our life was a perpetual irritant, yet Jonathan wouldn't acknowledge the problem. He even joked about us sharing a large home, living as one big family. My objections seemed childish to him. He'd say, "You're my wife, she's just my best friend." But I saw how his face lit up when she arrived, how they shared private glances that shut me out. I lied to friends and relatives, claiming our marriage was rock solid. Inside, I felt overshadowed by the bond Jonathan and Charlotte had never severed. Some nights, I woke up shaking, afraid he might sneak out to call her. He dismissed my worries, labeling me paranoid, but in my gut, I sensed I was losing a fight against a bond older and stronger than ours. Sometimes I'd stare at myself in the mirror, wondering if I simply wasn't enough. After nearly 14 years, I discovered I was pregnant. Jonathan and I had discussed trying for a baby, yet when the test came back positive, I was both thrilled and anxious. I hoped this child would unify us, that Jonathan would finally draw boundaries with Charlotte. I longed for a life free of her omnipresence. At first, he seemed excited. He held my hand in the doctor's office, helped me decide on baby names, but Charlotte inserted herself into every conversation. She wanted to plan the baby shower, wanted to discuss nursery decor. Jonathan encouraged it, as though this was her baby too. The more she got involved, the more I realized that I was merely a supporting character in this twisted triangle. I wanted to believe Jonathan would change, but inside, I knew. I was around 4 months pregnant when everything changed. One evening, Jonathan forgot his phone at home, and it buzzed repeatedly on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen, noticing Charlotte's name. A flurry of messages scrolled by, references to private jokes I didn't understand, pictures of them at a cafe earlier that day, though Jonathan had told me he was working late, and then a long thread discussing how connected they felt to each other. My stomach twisted in knots, but I forced myself to read it all. I learned that Jonathan had once referred to Charlotte as his true soulmate, lamenting that their marriage had ended before they'd found real happiness. He claimed the timing was off, that he still loved her in ways he couldn't put into words. I nearly dropped his phone when I read his confession that I was a good wife, but not the love of his life. My heart pounded and my hands shook. I took screenshots and emailed them to myself, a cold sense of resolve flooding through my veins. I felt numb yet seething. I waited for Jonathan to return, staying utterly calm while a storm raged inside me. When he came home, I politely told him his phone had been going off. He glanced at it, looking momentarily guilty, but said nothing about Charlotte. I realized he had no intention of being honest. There was no remorse in his eyes. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom and sobbed until I gagged. My entire marriage suddenly felt like a cruel joke. I thought about confronting him right then, but an odd clarity told me to wait. Revenge wouldn't bloom in the heat of the moment. I needed a plan that would ensure he felt every bit of betrayal he'd inflicted on me. In the days that followed, I wrestled with my fury. At work, I forced a smile, but inside I was replaying the messages I'd read. My baby bump was just beginning to show, a constant reminder that I had to protect not just myself, but also this innocent life. Jonathan continued his usual routines, texting Charlotte, meeting her for coffee, then coming home to me as though nothing was amiss. I stopped questioning him. I pretended ignorance, though every glance he threw at his phone made my blood boil. I made discreet moves. I consulted a lawyer recommended by a trusted colleague, one who specialized in cases where spouses were financially entangled with people outside the marriage. Before telling him everything, I gathered more evidence: bank statements, credit card bills showing suspicious charges at hotels and restaurants on days he claimed to be at business meetings. Through it all, I maintained the facade of a devoted wife. Then, in my 5th month of pregnancy, I quietly spoke to my boss about taking a leave under the pretense of high-risk complications. In reality, I wanted time to orchestrate my departure. I'd discovered I legally had grounds to claim certain assets if I could prove emotional neglect and deception. My lawyer guided me on how to secure the house, my finances, and future child support. I felt no guilt about it. Jonathan had shown none for what he was doing behind my back. Meanwhile, Charlotte acted more emboldened. She called Jonathan at midnight, asked him to fix her kitchen sink on a Sunday morning, and even left personal items in our home. I gritted my teeth, feigning a docile acceptance. Every time she crossed a boundary, I reminded myself that vengeance was near. In the darkest hours, I stroked my belly, promising my unborn child a better life than this twisted dynamic. One afternoon, I asked Jonathan to join me for what he assumed was a routine prenatal checkup. In truth, I'd scheduled an appointment with a couples counselor. The day before, I informed the counselor privately that I suspected an emotional affair. She advised that we could address it in session. Jonathan arrived, looking puzzled when he saw the counselor's door instead of the obstetrician's office. I let him in without explanation. We settled into chairs in a warmly lit room. The counselor introduced herself and asked about our marriage. Jonathan shot me a glare, but started talking about how stressful everything had been with the pregnancy, how he wanted support from his best friend Charlotte. I sat quietly until the counselor invited me to speak. That's when I recounted the text I'd seen, the receipts for clandestine outings, and my suspicion that Jonathan loved Charlotte more than he ever loved me. He stiffened, trying to deny it, but I calmly pulled out printed pages of their messages. He blanched. The counselor looked genuinely taken aback, and Jonathan stumbled over words of protest. "It's not what it looks like. She's just important to me. I never wanted to hurt you." My rage simmered beneath a mask of collected composure. I asked him one question. "Do you love her more than me?" He hesitated, sweat beading on his brow, then avoided my gaze. His silence was the only answer I needed. The counselor tried to mediate, urging Jonathan to be honest about his feelings. He finally admitted that Charlotte was like a soulmate, but insisted he still cared for me. I stood up, heart pounding, and declared I was done tolerating second place. I told him I wanted space to think about the future of our marriage. That was the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes. That evening, Jonathan begged me to talk things through, but I locked the bedroom door and slept alone. I was beyond heartache. I was plotting my exit. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan made half-hearted attempts at appeasing me, offered to reduce time with Charlotte, promised to keep her from calling so late. But he still refused to cut ties completely. I realized he never would. She was embedded in his heart. Meanwhile, I followed my lawyer's advice meticulously. I moved half of our joint funds into a separate account in my name. I prepared a formal complaint alleging emotional abandonment. I documented every instance of Jonathan's indiscretions, every shady expense. My belly grew larger, but instead of filling the nursery with baby items, I packed my belongings into boxes. Late at night, when Jonathan was asleep, I stuffed photo albums, important documents, and sentimental keepsakes into suitcases. One morning, Charlotte had the gall to show up at our doorstep with homemade muffins. She wanted to discuss baby shower themes with me, as if I were some naive friend. I mustered a polite smile, playing the gracious host. All the while, I fantasized about throwing her smug face out onto the curb. Before she left, she placed her hand on my belly and said, "I'll always be there for this baby." Her audacity was breathtaking. I managed a brittle laugh, seething inside. Finally, at 8 months pregnant, I set my trap. I told Jonathan we needed to spend a weekend at a quiet cabin, just the two of us, to reconnect before the baby arrived. He seemed relieved, hopeful that our marriage might salvage itself. In reality, I'd already arranged for a moving truck to come while we were gone. I wanted him out in the wilderness, disconnected from Charlotte, while my plan unfolded. We arrived at the secluded cabin on a Friday evening. No Wi-Fi, spotty phone reception, the perfect place for a final reckoning. That first night, Jonathan tried to cuddle me by the fireplace, but I gently pushed him away. My mind was on the movers clearing our home and the legal documents waiting to be filed. Early the next morning, as Jonathan was chopping wood outside, I stepped onto the porch and turned off his phone, slipping it into my bag. I wanted him unreachable when Charlotte undoubtedly called. By noon, tension hung thick in the air. He could sense my distance. We went for a walk along a narrow trail, leaves crunching underfoot. Eventually, I paused near a mossy log. My pregnant belly felt heavy, my feet ached, but my resolve was strong. I faced him and said, "I know you've never stopped loving Charlotte." He tried to protest, stumbling over hollow reassurances. I cut him off. "You've lied to me, betrayed me, and I'm done. We're done." His face paled. He reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. In that silent, forested moment, I watched the realization crash into him like a cold wave. Jonathan sank onto the log, tears brimming. He pleaded with me, claimed he'd break all contact with Charlotte if that's what I wanted. But I could see in his eyes that he was lying. Even if he tried, the hold she had on him was too strong. He would resent me, or relapse, or do something even more deceptive down the road. I refused to spend the rest of my life as a runner-up. I offered him no comfort, no sympathy, just the stark truth. I was leaving, and he had no say in it. We hiked back to the cabin in tense silence. He tried to use his phone to call Charlotte, but discovered it was dead. He turned to me with panic, and I merely shrugged. The next morning, I left him stranded there with limited fuel in the car. I drove away alone, my unborn baby kicking in my belly, heading toward a new life that no longer included him. I arrived back to find the house swept clean of my belongings, just as planned. The moving truck had taken everything to a rental home in my name. My lawyer had filed the papers, freezing our assets and securing an emergency order granting me exclusive use of the house. Jonathan was locked out with no clothes, no furniture, and no explanation for Charlotte, who undoubtedly would be frantic to reach him. I felt a savage satisfaction coursing through my veins. There was no forgiveness left in me. Over the next few days, Jonathan called repeatedly from unfamiliar numbers. Sometimes I'd answer just to let him hear silence before hanging up. I wanted him to feel the same isolation I'd endured. When he finally reached me through my lawyer, he demanded to know how I could do this to him. I calmly directed all inquiries to my attorney and ended the call. I refused to grant him the courtesy of a direct conversation. He sent emails proclaiming his love for me, apologizing for his confusion, but his words rang hollow. He wanted to have his cake and eat it too. Charlotte attempted to contact me, claiming that Jonathan was devastated and that I should at least speak to him. I blocked her number without a second thought. My child deserved a mother who stood tall in her own power. The day the divorce was finalized, I tossed my wedding ring into a pawn shop tray and walked away without looking back. A month later, I gave birth to a baby girl. I named her Hope, not because I held any for Jonathan, but because I wanted her to symbolize resilience. Holding her in my arms, I felt the enormity of starting fresh. I had faced betrayal, endured heartbreak, and exacted my revenge. In the end, I discovered the unbreakable truth. I deserved more than to be second to anyone, and I would never again settle for less.